Hello and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. I am your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. If you're enjoying this podcast, please share it with your friends or your network. It would be great for more people to be able to hear this, listen to this. It's been a blast to make. I love having these conversations, and it would be great for others to be able to listen to this. Our guest today is Michael Cooper. He is the author of Ephesiology, does a lot of work at ephesiology.com. Michael and I have a great discussion about the Ephesian Movement, the church in Ephesus, what happened with Paul and many others as they brought the word of the Lord to all of Asia in 2 years. It's pretty amazing what we see as the structure of leadership, the structure of what they have done within the church, and how it compares to the culture that we have in American Christianity and Christianity around the world, and what we can do to bring back that structure that we find in the early church. So here's my conversation with Michael Cooper. Enjoy. Michael Cooper, welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast. I'm excited to have you on. Thanks for coming.
Well, thanks for inviting me. This is great. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking to you as well. And I know you wrote a book, Ephesiology, about the Ephesian movement. And what are some of the things, as you were studying the Ephesian movement and you were writing the book, some things that everyday Christians may find surprising in the Ephesian movement, something that you learned in the middle of it?
Yeah, you know what? There were a few things that I did not anticipate learning as I got into the research for this book. Basically, the book, just to set the scene, is kind of taking a comprehensive look at what was going on in the city of Ephesus during the New Testament period. And it does that by looking at all of the documents that we have in the New Testament corpus. Yeah. And I mean, we have a lot. Nearly half of the New Testament talks about the church in Ephesus.
Wow.
So doing a kind of a comprehensive study of that, but weaving those texts together to tell the story of the church from beginning to the end, at least from what we know in the New Testament. And I think probably more than any other subject matter, if you will, pertaining to that movement, that surprised me more than others was the leadership structure of the movement.
Yeah.
You know, we were just talking about APEST, and we know about APEST. And so that's not so much a surprise as we know that was critical in the growth of the New Testament movement, the apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher roles that were so critical in equipping the saints to do the works of ministry. But I think probably what was more surprising was the relationship of those five with everyone else. And I came to a conclusion that I was surprised that I actually came to, and that was that much of the New Testament movement was a non-hierarchical movement, simply meaning that, you know, there weren't these special people called pastors and then everybody else kind of followed under them. But that they were peers among equals. There was leadership. Clearly, there was leadership, and we see that in Ephesians 4:11 and 12, as well as in 1st and 2nd Timothy. But it wasn't hierarchical. It was non-hierarchical, very much peer, relational, as they trained and equipped the people for ministry.
Wow.
And what I think, and I argue this in the book, that what the result was from that was that everybody viewed themselves as being involved in ministry, that they were all engaged. And, you know, we read, for example, in Acts chapter 19, two places, in verse 10 and verse 20, when Luke writes that all of Asia heard the word of the Lord. And the only way that that could have happened was for everybody to be equipped for ministry and everybody out proclaiming the gospel.
Yeah, that's right.
And, doing Jesus-y things in Asia Minor. And
Wow.
that can only happen, I think, in a structure that is non-hierarchical, that is very peer-oriented, that still recognizes that there are gifted people and they honor and respect those people and their gifts. And then, they're empowering others for ministry to use their gifts. They're inspiring them in difficult circumstances. They're entrusting them to disciple others, and they're reminding them to proclaim the word.
Yeah. I think that's so key and so important as I look at the structure maybe of the American church, where it's pretty hierarchical. It's like we have the paid pastoral staff that they get to do the ministry, and people come to a service to be serviced, right, to spiritually, and then they go home and like hopefully something impacted their life. But we don't see a total transformation like we did, in this Ephesian movement, to see, the word of the Lord has been heard by all of Asia Minor. And I think also, in that hierarchical structure up top, like studies have come out that, I mean, one study came out, 29% of all pastors have thought about quitting recently. And there's so much pressure on a solo leader with like trying to service the spiritual lives of everybody in their congregation. Have you seen anything that's been working in the States as far as like deconstructing this hierarchical leadership model into a non-hierarchical model?
I think right now there are nascent attempts to do this because, like you said, we're recognizing that a pastor-centric model isn't effective, where the vision and the mission of the church is all led by the pastor or a small group of leaders. To be honest, culturally speaking, we're in the United States, we're kind of structured in such a way that hierarchy is important.
Yeah.
And positions of leadership and the authority that those leaders have are important in our culture, although recognizably people are leery these days of any types of authority. But the structures are still there in our context. And so naturally, the church inherits some of that structure just because of the culture that it's a part of. What's interesting in the context of the New Testament is, there was still a hierarchical structure in regards to civil authorities, the Roman Empire, and so forth. And interestingly enough, and this was another surprising discovery, if you will, of the church in Ephesus, this bishop, elders, deacons, the leadership structure was borrowed from civil society. And it was at some level hierarchical. But here's the beauty of what Paul does in Ephesus is that he borrows structures, but he redefines them. And so he places greater value on the character of the people that are in those leadership positions, and that character being extended out to a Christological understanding of what leadership is. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. He came to serve the many. He came and that changed what leadership looks like. As he tells James and John, the Gentiles did this, but you're to do this. And he gives us that model of washing the disciples' feet. And so that changes everything in leadership in terms of its function. But the form, Paul still uses. The social form he still uses. What we haven't done in the United States, I think, I think this is pretty much across the world, is that we still use the forms of our culture, and we still use their functions. And so we have this hierarchy, whereas in the New Testament, it was a flat model of leadership. And it was very much focused on being sure that everyone was equipped for ministry, and that they, in the space that they occupied, that they were effective in their ministry.
Yeah, and I mean, you've mentioned that Jesus served many. There's all this concept of servant leadership has been really exciting for the church. Like the church has taken it on, and it seems like that there may be some misconceptions of service and servanthood in the Bible and servant leadership. Is there any misconceptions there for us to glean from?
Yeah, interesting that you bring that up. I think, I don't remember if I addressed this in this book or not, but if we look at the whole idea of servant leadership and the context in which it emerges in the 1960s and 70s with Robert Greenleaf, Catholic theologian who recognized that we were living in desperate times where we had examples of leaders that were not at all servants, the political the leaders, as well as other social and civic leaders. And he was deeply concerned with what he was seeing in culture. And so he argued for this idea of servant leadership out of a particular cultural context that was experiencing very desperate times. I mean, people were rebelling against leadership and authority and so on. And we have a number of, those cultural examples in the context of the United States, where this kind of lends to the shift in our thinking about what leadership should be. I think the unintended consequence of what servant leadership has become is that it doesn't any longer recognize the cultural constraints that gave rise to servant leadership. And so that's not to say that, we shouldn't teach about servant leadership or anything like that. But what it is to say is to understand that it doesn't matter what kind of leader you are or where you are leading. If you are a follower of Christ, you are to be a servant. And so in a very technical biblical sense, there are servants and there are leaders, and all leaders are to be servants. And there's really not such a thing as servant leadership. I think sometimes when we put adjectives in front of nouns, we kind of diminish the impact that the noun should have. And so we want leaders, and we want strong leaders, leaders who are passionate about equipping others for ministry, that are inspiring others by being models themselves, much like Paul was, who would say, follow me like I'm following Jesus. Be imitators of God. And so we need those kinds of strong leaders, but we also need leaders who understand that they are servants, that it's not about them, but it's really about others. And Paul, I think, just beautifully models this in his leadership, where he seems to be pushing out his authority and his leadership to others. And you see this, I think, probably most remarkably with Timothy. They co-author 7 epistles together out of the 13 that he writes. And he gives Timothy just incredible opportunities to be in leadership in Philippi and Thessalonica and Ephesus and other places as well. And so, that kind of leadership that is saying, you know what, I'm entrusting you with the gifts that God has given you. Fan those things into flame and I'm going to be alongside of you,
Hmm.
joining with you in all of your suffering and all of your trials, but all of your achievements as
Yeah.
well.
I think that's important for us to realize, and I think moving, that leadership is important, and all leaders should be servants. We should serve others. We should equip others for the ministry. A lot of times when I've seen like this inverted triangle, when you're thinking of servant leadership, and leaders are down below serving up towards something else. As I think about that, sometimes I think of Atlas holding up the world, and I think of, man, are we like calling ourselves like Greek gods? Like we have the power to hold things up. And so sometimes I think that it actually becomes, because we have servant leadership, it almost becomes manipulative, and we don't realize it. It's subconscious. It's us trying to hold something up instead of share leadership across the board.
Yeah, I think you make a great point there. I mean, I think in many ways, the idea of servant leadership has become a more of a power dynamic.
Yeah.
Something that, we tell others, I'm a servant leader, so you should follow me.
Right.
Or I'm a servant leader, therefore, whatever. But what we see with Paul, as I mentioned, is it wasn't just him serving others, but him joining together with others and others joining with him. I mean, it was a partnership.
Yeah.
On a very peer level
Hmm.
that they were being called to in their following of Christ. And this is, I think, important. There was one leader that the New Testament missionaries followed, and that was Jesus.
Yeah.
And they agreed on that. They knew what Jesus's mission was, and they gladly joined together with others in that mission. And I mean, if that were not the case, I can't explain the astronomical rise of Christianity, growth of Christianity, in any other way.
Yeah, and it is Jesus. And I think a lot of times we get in the way of Jesus in our structures and, borrowing from culture, trying to figure it out ourselves. I mean, our own hubris, something gets in the way of Jesus. How can we get out of the way and let Jesus do the work and have this big move of God?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's so critical. For sure. It's almost, I think sometimes that we might think that we can improve upon Jesus's mission or on his vision for the church. And we can't. I mean, it's really joining with him together, suffering together for the cause of the gospel. And he's laid out what that looks like. And we just simply need to imitate him. And if we're all doing that, then praise the Lord.
Yeah.
If we're following him and God is using that and we're joining with him in his mission, then boy, we should just celebrate what we all are doing in regards to following him.
Yeah. And this may be something for just, the missionaries that I train or people trying to go out as missionaries. But a lot of times when we look at the New Testament and we think of missionary journeys, we think of Paul, but Paul wasn't alone. What kind of people did Paul bring with him? And what are some of the roles that you saw while you were studying this Ephesian movement of like, how do we get things started, how movement started?
Yeah. So, this was another one of the interesting things to learn about in Paul's ministry in Ephesus. He had something like 26 people that he directly worked with in that movement in Asia. That he was in personal contact with. So, for example, when he tells Timothy, entrust these things that you've heard from me to others, that's his that's his assumption that he is addressing to all of the people that he's working with.
Mm-hmm.
And so if all of these 26 are being entrusted to take the things that they've learned to teach others who will teach others, then you can see the dynamics of a movement right there. But people came from all walks of lives. There were business people, there were lawyers, there were doctors, there were those who were slaves, and so on. And Paul, again, the beauty of his relationship with them was it was never as one who held authority over them, but that he looked at himself as a peer, that they were doing this together. Now, that's not to say that he didn't have authority. He certainly did as an apostle, but he didn't use that authority because it would have been ineffective in a movement. It would have placed the burden on him to do these things. And so instead, he looks at these that were gathered around him as peers and co-laborers. And of course, he refers to them in that way frequently. And one of the other things that was interesting too was the words he uses to describe many of these people. And they're translated, it's interesting, it's the same word that's translated in different ways. And that word is diakonos. We're most familiar with that word in 1 Timothy chapter 3, when Paul talks about the character of the deacons. But he uses that same word to describe himself. He uses it to describe Timothy, who's a servant. In fact, in chapter 4, he tells Timothy, be a good servant, be a good diakonos. I've just described what this is. Now be a good one. And he uses it to describe Jesus, who's a servant. And he uses it to describe other people that he worked with. And interestingly enough, though, the English translation often will choose different words other than servant or deacon to describe those people. So, Timothy's described as a minister, be a good minister. Phoebe in Romans 16, who is described as a servant, not a deacon. The English translation uses the word servant rather than deacon or minister.
Right.
And so you have these kinds of interpretations that come into our translations of the English, when we should be thinking of, and I don't think there's any good reason to change the meaning of that word due to the person that it's attributed to. But we should look at all of them as working together as servants together, diakonos. And the interesting thing, Joshua, that I found here was, as I was studying this, and the people that Paul referred to as servants or diakonos, they served in positions of apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. And boy, I just found that fascinating. These weren't deacons who were taking care of the menial tasks of a church. They weren't emptying the wastebaskets. They weren't collecting the tithes and offerings. They weren't doing these kinds of things. But these were people that were significantly engaged in equipping the saints for works of ministry. And that was a revolutionary for me as I think about the New Testament church.
To be able to have people within every function that Jesus gave to the church, the body of Christ, to be able to be serving in that. Did you find how did those people within the apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers interact together so that they could create something more holistic?
That type of interaction, just because of the nature of the written documents, you don't see as much. Right. You don't see apostles interacting with shepherds or teachers and those types of things. But what you do see is the interaction of people as a body of Christ. that there was a real understanding that, we're all equally gifted. We're gifted in different ways, but those giftings are important. And of course, Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 12. And so because they're important, then we all have a role to play together in the body of Christ to work toward the fulfillment of God's mission. Mm. And certainly you see that throughout the writings of especially the Pauline epistles.
And it seems like throughout the centuries since this movement happened, and we continue in Christendom, and the church changes and it morphs in it with culture, and we put on the essentials of church, different cultural aspects. So the church in America is going to look different than the church in China or the church in Africa, and so. What are some of the things that we have put on? I'll go with the American church, maybe even American evangelicalism. What are some of the things that we have put on that we need to shed to get back to what we see in the New Testament?
Joshua, I'll be bold enough to say that these cultural forms yeah, absolutely. We are wearing them, but we've also exported them.
Yes.
And like you, I've traveled a good bit of the world, and I'm always surprised when I walk into a church, and it doesn't matter where it is, but how uniform it is.
Yeah.
There's usually a pastor standing behind a pulpit. I mean, I can remember walking into a church in Nepal years ago, and just thinking that this is going to be a beautiful cultural experience.
Right.
The church was made out of bamboo, and there were mud was packing the walls to keep the wind out and the cold out. We were sitting on the floor on carpets. And as I sat and waited for the service to begin, I was making some observations. And there was a drum set in the front, an electric guitar, an amplifier. There was a Christmas tree. It was in November when I was there. There was a Christmas tree, and in English, it said Merry Christmas. And I thought, holy cow, what have we exported to other countries that gives them the impression that this is what the New Testament church looks like?
Yeah.
And so I think there are a number of cultural forms that, for good or bad, right or wrong, that we need to rethink. And I think it begins with leadership and the leadership structure of the North American church for sure. But we see this in other places as well.
Oh, yeah.
But, as you've been involved with 5Q and the APEST typology, that really is where we need to recover a good understanding of the New Testament church.
Yep.
And see the apostle, the prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher roles fully functioning in the context of the church. We've placed such a great emphasis on the shepherd and the teacher.
Yep.
And what has resulted is that we've created churches that are very heavy in the shepherd teacher roles, which are absolutely needed in the church today. But there's a whole gift set, the apes that we often talk about, that is catalytic in nature, that we desperately need in the church today. Those who can take the gospel and effectively engage the community with the message in catalytic ways. So I think we really desperately need to recover that APEST typology in the context of the church. I think too, if I were to think more about this, and of course these are things that I do anyway, along with that, the pastor-centric model, I think has seen its day. again, I think this goes to the need for us to recover APEST. I think the program-centric nature of the church that really demands professionals to perform specific duties, whether it would be children's ministry or music ministry or something of that nature, that has to shift as well. Again, pushing the roles of ministry out to all of us who are ministers, the body of Christ. And then I think thirdly, the building centric nature of the church has to change, where we need to get away from the place of ministry happening, and even in some churches, the place of discipleship happening in a building, a centralized place, and see that really pushed out to be decentralized and into more locations.
Yeah, that's really key. The local church that I attend, about a year before the pandemic hit, Jesus asked us to give up our building, and we became nomadic as a church. We had house churches, different house churches that we split up into. We have house church leaders, and we come together now once a month as a larger corporate gathering, but we're in the homes the rest of the time. And this model was very key and vital for us to be healthy when COVID hit and the pandemic hit and people went inside. And the majority of churches went from a program in person on a Sunday morning to a program online on a Sunday morning. And it really didn't shift much. And a lot of people, I think, were lonely. They didn't get this connection that they needed in true, authentic community. And we were able to see this sustainability happen because of the model that we have almost stumbled into. I mean, we're trying to go and be obedient to Jesus in the midst of things and let him lead us into whatever he wants us to do. And so I think it was a testimony to leaders in the church that were listening to Jesus and saying, okay, we'll do that. It makes no sense, but this is what we're going to do. And so they walk forward. And I think that needs to continue. And I think there's a few things that are missing in the middle of that. And one of the things is this desire and the structure for like solid teaching in the middle of what we're doing. We do a lot of discovery, and we're doing discovery Bible studies on a Sunday morning within our home church. And, this is what I teach when I go overseas, and we want to do discovery Bible studies to start movement so that everybody can really grasp Scripture and then find out for themselves. It's not reliant on foreigners as they come in. But what is that role of teaching, and how can we implement this in a decentralized network?
This is something that I am giving a lot of thought to, because I agree with you. I think, COVID has given us a wonderful opportunity to explore different structures and models that can be effective in our cultures. And I think one of the things, as you alluded to, that has seen real fruit is us being forced into small groups, into our homes, and seeing that decentralizing and moving us away from a building-centric model. Yeah. But as you said, there are so many now that are rushing back to that old paradigm. Yep. And for whatever reason, are just kind of doing what they did and going back to the status quo. And I think we miss an opportunity there. In relationship to that, I think looking again at the movement in Ephesus, Paul spent 2 years or so teaching in what was called the school of Tyrannus. Yep. We don't know anything about that school. other than it was a philosophical school. The Tyrannus that can be translated into English as tyrant. So it could have been a pejorative way to refer to whoever the headmaster of that school was, that he was a tyrant, an educational tyrant. We just don't know. But what we do know is Paul saw that as a place to equip and train, as well as discuss and dialogue and engage the culture. And that we have to recover in the church. And so in that place, whatever that would look like today, is a place where I see equipping and training of the saints for works of ministry to take place. In some ways, Paul modeled his ministry after the philosophers. I always say Socrates now, thanks to Bill and Ted, but Socrates. And when Plato wrote about Socrates, he said that Socrates saw his classroom as the streets of Athens. And so there's something to say about that we need to be looking at the marketplace as our place of engaging and equipping and training the saints, not just in a central building, but dispersed wherever we are. So in many ways, it can be thought of in terms of taking the training to the marketplace.
Wow.
If there are groups of business people that can spare an hour for lunch to gather together to do equipping and training in their office space, that would be the perfect place to do that. And so I think there's always going to be a role for that equipping and training that is essential to ensuring that the church will continue in its historic faith.
Yeah, it seems like we probably have to do some reorienting around what is important, what is vital in our lives. As Americans like to run ragged and work really hard, and they don't have time or energy to put into being with others in any ministry setting. They're like, I pay somebody else to do it, let them do it. I'm going to run ragged and work really hard over here. So there's probably going to have to be some reorientation of our life choices and our lifestyle choices so that this can be accomplished.
Right. Yeah. And we need to adapt to that and adjust to what our culture is helping us to see. And one of the ways, Joshua, that we've done that is through what we've called Ephesiology master classes. And you can see behind me, this is my studio where I do my recording of different courses. But we have a team of academics from all around the world that are joining together to record some high quality, academically rigorous, but accessible courses that are focusing on helping the church to have a good, solid foundation on its historic faith, and to build on that. And we've modeled this really around the APEST model. We want to see more people equipped as apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers.
That's so good.
Who can equip others for ministry.
Yeah, that's helpful to be able to go there. And so, if you go to ephesiology.com, you can find that, right?
You can, or to masterclasses.ephesiology.com.
Nice. There you go. And I think, that's going to be really essential to be able to be equipped wherever you're at. And I think this is something as a dispersed model that's been working well, that we've been able to get training and equipping out in different ways. I have, when my wife and I lived in the Middle East for a long time, when we worked with Syrian refugees, and we were able to get some discovery Bible studies and the New Testament in a spoken Arabic language. It wasn't a classical Arabic language. It was actually spoken Syrian dialect. So as we got these recordings, we were able to put them on SD cards, and there were a ton of them that we could just hand out to people, and they could take those and they could facilitate a Discovery Bible study with their friends and their family, and they didn't need us to be able to do it. And that was something that they were able to be equipped by. So there's all sorts of models of taking some training that we can actually equip somebody for the next generation and the next generation, and it could go on without us. And I think because of some of these little cards that we had that we were able to just plug into cell phones, we actually saw generational growth, like second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth generations going down the line, because people are just passing it along and they're obeying whatever they heard. And it was pretty amazing that sort of technology that we have at our disposal right now can be actually used to actually further the kingdom of God. And I think we're starting to catch up. I don't think we've been good at it for a while, but I think we're starting to catch up, and we're able to equip in this space. So it's been really good.
Yeah, that's cool.
I also think, when I was thinking of your story, and I think of adapting a leadership model, if you're looking at bishops and elders and deacons, it really reminded me of the American military, and it just as like a model of leadership. And it seems like we've started to really, take this militaristic model and put it on top of the church, of saying, this top-down hierarchical thing. And I think some of those things, there's a balance in here of being culturally appropriate and taking the culture that we should into church and being countercultural. And so what is that balance of being countercultural and taking something from the cultural so it's relevant to everyday life for the people that we have in church anywhere in the world?
Yeah, well, I think that the lens that we should look through on all of those things is a Christological lens.
Mm-hmm.
We have the four Gospels that give us a beautiful picture of Jesus and his life and how he lived his life.
Yeah.
And if we were to look at leadership through his lens, if we look at relationships through that lens, if we look at how we interact with the culture in general through a Christological lens, then we're going to have a better understanding of the contextual nature that we need to strive for in regards to the forms that our churches or our ministries will take. But it's always looking at our model, and that being Jesus, as our anchor for how we will adapt different forms to the functions that we learn from his life.
Yeah. I've been reflecting a lot recently on John 12:24. Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. And then Jesus continues on, like, whoever loses his life will find it. Like, you have to lose your life and follow me. And for me, what that little grain of wheat represents is, it's my ego. It's, my everything that I want to accomplish, my selfish ambition. But if that dies and I can say, Jesus, do something with this seed, it can bear fruit, and I can start to follow him. And I think a lot of times we need to look through that Christological lens to be able to bear fruit and to move forward in a fruitful way. Because if we don't, it's just in our own strength. It's just in a place where we're going to be alone in it. And through that Christological lens, it says that you were bearing much fruit means we're doing it together. There's a togetherness in a Jesus-centric model, and there's an aloneness in a human-centric model. It's
it's good.
I found that fascinating. I've just been thinking about that. Michael, thank you for this. This has been fascinating for me and been really good. There's two questions I like to ask at the end. Number one is, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh, man. Oh, well, gosh, my 21-year-old self. Thankfully, I was still in college. You know what? The advice that I would give myself, and I probably still wouldn't take it, would be, you know what? You need to chill a little bit. Your intensity, your passion is not always a good thing. I think really to be honest, I think that would probably be a good thing, to relax a little bit, to enjoy the proximity of Jesus in my life more, and don't rush so headlong into things, by throwing caution to the wind or whatever.
That's great advice, and something we should all take. Anything that you've been reading or watching lately that you could recommend?
Well, what I'm working on right now is a study of First Clement. And First Clement was written, I think, many scholars will date First Clement to the end of the first century, to somewhere in the 90s, sometimes around 97 AD.
Mm-hmm.
I think First Clement was probably written within the living memory of Peter and Paul's martyrdom in Rome. So I would date it into the late 60s, maybe into the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
It's such an interesting letter. Early on in the history of the church, it was actually included as a part of the New Testament corpus because it was so valued. It's 65 chapters long.
Wow.
And it's just a beautiful testimony about how one church, the church in Rome, is so deeply concerned about the church in Corinth. And it's given the title First Clement, probably, well, it was given the title later, but many had attributed the letter actually being written by Clement. But the internal evidence of the letter suggests that it was written by the leaders of the church in Rome to the church in Corinth, who was still experiencing, actually, it looks like there was a period of peace in the church in Corinth, but at this time, there are factions that arise. And so the church of Rome is hearing about this. They are so deeply concerned for the witness of the church in Corinth, because it wasn't just the factions within, but it was the turmoil that was being caused from without, as non-Christians were looking at the church in Corinth and saying, what is this? These people are no different than we are. And so those leaders in Rome were so concerned. But anyway, I'm doing this study and trying to understand more about the practices of the early church, and how important it was for there to be harmony among believers. And the conclusion that I'm coming to in this study is that what ultimately achieves harmony are two things. Mm-hmm. One, our sole focus on Jesus. If we are solely focused on him, then we cannot help but to live in unity with one another. And then secondly, our mission. If we're focused on Jesus and focused on his mission, you know what? We're going to welcome people to join us, and we are going to want to join with others who are sharing that focus on Jesus and focus on his mission. And I think that's so important for us today as a church, to rediscover how significant a life dedicated to Jesus is and dedicated to his mission, and how unifying and harmonizing that is among all of us who call ourselves followers of Christ.
All right. So we know Ephesiology.com to find out some of your work. Any other places or any other thing that you've worked on that you want to highlight for us?
Yeah.
And how we can find it?
Yeah, Ephesiology.com. The book is Ephesiology, the study of the Ephesian Movement, and William Carey Publishing is the publisher for that book. We do the masterclasses.ephesiology.com. That we're partnering with a number of different organizations, 5Q, of course, being one of them, along with CREO and others, to offer a master's program, a master's degree program, from a seminary in India, Mission India Theological Seminary. And so, there are a number of resources there for people to enjoy, and many of them are free resources. So I'd encourage people to click on those free courses that I'm sure, because I know the people that are developing them will be a real blessing to others.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you so much for being on. It was a privilege.
It was my privilege as well. Thank you, Joshua.
Thanks.